Disclaimer, this video has mentions of gun violence and school shootings. Also, if it's preferable, there's a written version linked in the description. To shorten the answer to a very loaded question, censorship in any medium, gaming included, is wrong and shouldn't be supported under any circumstance. An idea which I'll return to later in much greater detail is the actual definition of censorship, but in its simplest form, censorship is defined as a system in which an authority limits the ideas that people are allowed to express and prevents books, films, works of art, documents, or other kinds of communication from being seen or made available to the public because they include or support certain ideas. In spite of this relatively clear definition, akin to many sensationalized topics, the definition of censorship has become twisted and conflated with similar concepts. Because of this, especially with gaming in recent history, many decisions made by creators and distributors have been criticized as censorship when this is not the reality. This critical misconception has made the debate around censorship in gaming heated and polarizing, yet incredibly muddled. The discussion has been going almost since the inception of the medium in the 70s, and while the specific subject matter and cultural relevance has shifted drastically, the debate has continued up until present. I believe the reason debate over censorship in gaming has been so vitriolic is because the medium is relatively new, as well as how it stands out from other media in being interactive. This interactivity makes consumers all the more sensitive to changes, an aspect highlighted by Carmen Maniron in their article stating,
"Video games are also designed to demand a high level of user interactivity. When playing games, players interact as agents of the game, adopting a participatory role that goes beyond that of mere spectator of a movie, which is a passive experience in terms of tangible user input."
While the debate over censorship in gaming has generally caused dramatic arguments from both supporters and detractors, topics which I'll be going over shortly, the development which prompted me to research this debate has stirred relatively little controversy despite its presence in one of the most popular games currently. On the 4th of January this year, Genshin Impact's official Twitter account and developer blog announced the upcoming release of new skins for 4 playable characters in the game. Optional for worldwide players, mandatory for domestic Chinese players. The skins for Amber, Jean, Mona and Rosaria feature few major changes, mainly just covering up certain areas subtly and adjusting outfits accordingly. Because of this, the reaction to the skins was pretty minor, at least from the game's Western audience who mainly celebrated that the change would not affect them. While this change has garnered little reaction from the usually boisterous anti-censorship gamers, as a concept they represent a lot of the contemporary debate around censorship and how it has developed over the past few decades. However, to fully explain this I need to contextualize the discussion by first giving an abridged history of the debate over censorship in gaming. While some eras of this debate have already been analysed to the point of being overdone, I hope to bring focus to some of the more overlooked aspects of the conversation and highlight new perspectives on the more worn-out points. Typical of any new media, since video games have become accessible to the general public, they have been surrounded by some form of controversy. The first game to gain major negative attention was 1976's Death Race arcade cabinet. Of course, seeming archaic by modern standards, the chunky pixels representing vehicular manslaughter outraged parents of young players. While similar games received similar backlash throughout the era, outrage quietened upon the well-documented industry crash in the early 80s. The revival was led by family-friendly company Nintendo, who made clear their strict standards on publishing games. Of course, this didn't stop more adult-oriented games from getting created, with competitor Sega standing apart from Nintendo with their willingness to release some of the games Nintendo would not. And as always, publishing on the PC was always a more accessible option for some creators wanting to avoid external publishing standards. A notable example of this is a backlash faced by 1987's new release in the Leisure Suit Larry series, discussed by John Williams in his 1988 article in Magazine of the Era, Computer Game World. The article goes in-depth contextualizing the controversy around the game's sexual content and the morality of publishing content like this in a medium often aimed at children. While I appreciate the presence of a conversation around sexuality in gaming so early on, what makes the article stand out is the references to the potential of censorship in the medium. Williams introduces the topic through cross-referencing with film standards.
Which brings us to the point of social responsibility. In the motion picture industry, it is the responsibility of the movie company to submit each finished product to the MPAA for evaluation. Each product is given a G, PG, PG-13, R or X rating. The triple X rating on some movies is strictly a marketing ploy. Through this system, the motion picture industry has circumvented the threat of government controls and given concerned citizens a way to steer clear of those titles that offend them. The MPAA is a socially responsible organisation that works. Should such a system be put in place for computer software?
Williams then references an interview he had with industry expert Ken Wash, executive director of the Software Publishers Association of America, to give a more informed opinion.
Adult computer software is nothing to worry about. It's not an issue that the government wants to spend any time with. They just got done with a big witch hunt in the music recording industry, and they got absolutely nowhere. Ken's job is to protect the interest of computer software publishers in Washington, so he would hardly be expected to advocate the initiation of a rating standard that would cost software developers millions each year to enforce. His overall opinion seems to be that as long as we attempt to let the buyer know of anything possibly offensive inside a box, we have done our jobs as members of society.
These insights of Wash and Williams provide an interestingly ironic look into the relative simplicity of video game censorship in the late 80s. It is almost reassuring to see that there has always been room for nuanced conversation around the debate over video game accessibility. However, the conversation was about to become more public and much less niche in the following decade. The 90s brought upon the inevitable evolution of games, with the capabilities of what the medium could portray rapidly growing closer towards what many believe to be reality. In retrospect, it's easy to overlook the outdated pixelated real people in Mortal Kombat, or the crusty interactive horror of Night Trap, but to the parents of the era, they were seen as potentially traumatizing and corruptive influences. Both of these games were key in the hearings which eventually led to the creation of the ESRB in 1994. This very public debate on the censorship of games caused international outrage, and I believe it was key in solidifying gaming as an aspect of counterculture. As I stated in the introduction, this era of censorship in gaming has been well documented, and when it comes to commentary on the events surrounding the introduction of the ESRB in the 90s, I doubt I have anything new to bring to the conversation. The same stands for the next era, but it is important to not overlook how impactful it has been to the perception of gaming in the modern era. While it is not directly linked to censorship, it does concern issues surrounding accessibility to games heavily intertwined with conversations on censorship. In the late 90s and throughout the 2000s and leaking into the early 2010s, it became a trend to blame violent crimes on the influence of violent video games. It happened with the horrific Columbine shooting in 1999 and was still happening with the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting. In the mass media coverage of such tragedies, as soon as it was found out that the perpetrators have played video games, some journalists found it tasteful to label them as the sole influence in leading people to commit such crimes. Upon further inspection, these arguments are exposed as under-researched and often as scapegoating to distract from actual problems, such as societal influences or the convenience of access to violent firearms. This phenomenon is put under a microscope in Ferguson and Markey's book Mortal Kombat, which exemplifies a particularly distasteful example. In 2009, Chris Beeson was convicted of breaking and entering the home of his ex-wife's family and proceeding to murder her, her new husband, his 22-year-old son, and his ex-wife's 2 teenage children. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but Beeson's defense came up with an excuse to try and help him. Markey and Ferguson explain,
So they hatched a novel alternative theory of the crime. Harris, the defence claimed, hadn't killed the family at all. In fact, he'd walked in on the family's 14-year-old son Dylan killing the family, and had then been forced to kill Dylan in self-defence. The defence called upon social psychologist Dr. Craig Anderson, as mentioned earlier, a long-time critic of violent games. Dr. Anderson argued that 14-year-old Dylan had a propensity towards violence, in part because he liked to play the violent video game Mortal Kombat, the best-selling American-made fighting series. It had sold over 30 million copies. Jurors were even shown 3 minutes of gameplay from Mortal Kombat in an attempt to convince them that such games could push a child to murder his entire family.
Markey and Ferguson go on to expose Anderson, who has become infamous for his irrational tirade against video games.
Dr. Anderson admitted that no research studies had linked playing violent video games with subsequent violent behaviour, that Dr. Anderson himself had played Mortal Kombat without becoming violent, and that a majority of young boys in fact play video games without becoming aggressive. Dr. Anderson also confessed that according to the parameters scholars like him used to define a violent video game, even a game like Pac-Man would be considered violent video. When asked about a 2011 Supreme Court decision criticising his research, Anderson, sounding a bit like a conspiracy theorist, implied that the video game industry might have helped write it.
This case exemplifies the absurdity of the debates surrounding video games at the start of the 21st century, and the lengths some would go to link the medium to violence. Unfortunately, there is a litany of similar stories, mostly from this era, possibly due to the popularity of the medium skyrocketing. Luckily, in most cases, a link to video games has never been treated with too much seriousness, but in spite of the many studies disproving the connection to violence, the stain left on the public conscience remains present. However, as we get closer to present, the drama surrounding games and censorship has become less vitriolic and more insular to the gaming community. Starting around the late 2000s and gaining steam in the 2010s, fans of Japanese games became more vocal with their complaints on games being censored upon being imported for Western players. These complaints largely surrounded more sexualized content getting covered up, so to speak. Upon localization, games would feature once scantily clad characters getting more provocative areas covered up, or more sexually charged scenes getting changed or outright removed for what these fans saw as no good reason and claimed was censorship. Entire forums and YouTube channels were started to document and rouse outrage around these changes, leading to almost omnipresent complaints upon most Japanese games getting localized. Luckily, with the subject matter being relatively lightweight compared to previous eras of censorship, there has not been a lack of backlash calling out these communities for their nitpicking. One of my favourite examples of this surrounds Nintendo's localization of Monolith Soft's 2015 Wii U game Xenoblade Chronicles X. Eurogamer's Martin Robinson reported the controversial change made to the game upon localization.
Unlike its predecessor, Xenoblade Chronicles X allows players to model their own avatar, presenting them with a set of potions with which to create their own character. One of those options, which controlled the size of a player's bust, has now been removed completely.
In spite of being a minor change not affecting the gameplay whatsoever, the comments of the article are full of debate.
Even if it wasn't related to boobs, I'd still kick up a fuss over anything being removed. A localization's job should be to modify existing content to other countries' languages, not remove content. Censorship is wrong. If there's an issue with the original, then that should be addressed directly. I'm not fragile and resent someone looking over my shoulder and deciding what I should or shouldn't see. Who knows what it will be next time? Japanese culture clash again. Nothing new here. I love Nintendo and was going to get this, but regardless of how big or small the change is, I cannot support censorship when there is an option for raising the age rating, so I will play one of the many other games available right now.
These comments accentuate the frustration many gamers felt over games being changed, and these comments also show how quick many are to claim changes upon localization as censorship. In Matt S.'s article on misconceptions on censorship, which I will go into further detail on later, he gives a much more misguided example showing how nonsensical some of these complaints can be.
Heck, just to show how silly these censorship arguments can get, there was a big uproar when Sega announced that it was going to patch in a fix for a bug in the Nintendo Switch Hatsune Miku game that was causing her skirt to fly up randomly. This was a bug and was never part of the developer's intent whatsoever, so patching the bug was the creative intention.
Looking at the article Matt S. cited, it is clear why many roll their eyes at some of these anti-censorship protesters.
A prudish luge from Fukushima, Japan going by the handle Naganagi Plus ratted to Sega customer support. The glitch wasn't an issue for most other people, since while you were playing, the skirts would lift up and stay up during segments of the dance routine, giving fans a bit of unexpected fan service. What's interesting is that the bug cropped up earlier in February, providing gamers with a lot of moments to get some clear glimpses at the undergarments of the young maidens, while performing at various cotillions.
While the phrase is overused, I can't help but cringe at the phrasing used in this article, to the point where I really had to question if it was satire. Unfortunately not. In spite of the amount of backlash these changes can have, to the point where whole communities group together to protest them, it would be unfair to overlook the presence of other gamers quick to chastise these complaints as unimportant. GameFAQs user Adam Peltz made a post complaining about the hypocrisy surrounding many arguments made against censorship.
Don't make this about boobs and butts if you really are that principled. Prioritise your complaints appropriately and in a way that actually shows that you have an educated anti-censorship agenda.
And later he concludes his post stating,
However, as a gamer, I've noticed that you anti-censorship people are just shooting from the hip and you don't really know where to aim. And you're going to cause more harm in the long run, especially if you do accomplish your goals and localizing entities are reluctant to censor character art. If your complaints actually become the beliefs of a significant number of gamers and companies are forced to take notice, see if that really leads to positive results. See if that butt crack really leads to increased sales and a healthier JRPG market in North America.
I believe these extracts of the forum post encapsulate a lot of the issues surrounding this era of gaming censorship. A lot of the complaints seem to be coming from a very reactionary and uninformed perspective. Adam Peltz emphasizes this in his warning that if the relatively niche audience of Western JRPG fans continue to relentlessly critique localization efforts, all they will achieve is alienating publishers as well as holding back the genre from growth, leading to less and less chances of obscure games getting localized. Moving away from this era, we find ourselves at the most current focus of the discussion surrounding censorship. Especially in the latter half of the last decade, conversations around the Chinese government's control over media have gained more attention from the Western gaming community. I believe there are many factors contributing to this timing. From 2000 till 2014, consoles were banned in China, making the industry entirely focused on online-based PC and mobile games, contrasting the heavily console-based Western market. Since the ban lifted, stories of the changes being made to games being imported into China gained some attention, but it was not until Chinese-produced games gained more global success that the government-imposed restrictions present in the country were put under more scrutiny. I do not want to simplify or abridge this era, but to give a quick summary before I return to it later in more detail, in recent years the rules on the content of Chinese games have grown stricter and stricter, with said restrictions focusing on protecting and reinforcing national, moral and political values. While this might not seem like a major issue, upon critical thinking it is obvious why putting something as subjective as morals on a government level enforced by law can easily cause problems to arise. As I said, I will return to this in more detail later, but what can be recognised as a thorough line throughout the entirety of this short history is that each era features some sort of moral aspect. Whether it's the morals of letting young players be potentially corrupted into criminals, or the morals of whether sexualized JRPGs should remain unchanged upon localization, morals are always being put up to the question. This phenomenon of morals being intrinsically linked to conversations of censorship is known as moral panic. Throughout the last section, I have had to dodge subconsciously referencing the concept of moral panic as I wanted to save it for its own section, but once I have explained, hopefully it will be clear how naturally this part relates to the previous one. The term moral panic was coined in 1973 by Stanley Cohen, but the concept can be recognized much further back into history. Cohen describes,
"Societies appear to be subject, even now and then, to periods of moral panic. A condition, episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media."
Looking back at the previous section, it is clear how this idea links to society's perception of video games. I am hardly the first person to make this connection. All the way back in 2000, Anna Everett wrote an article making the link upon observation of some reactions to the Columbine school shootings. She explains,
"In the wake of the Columbine High School massacre, an unfortunate target is once again caught in the mediated crosshairs of our latest societal moral panic. That perpetual target is today's youth culture and its preoccupation with the internet and video games, fueling much of our national discontent over and distrust of PC, post-Columbine, youth culture, besides a new millennial generation gap of sorts, is the traditional print and broadcast media's intense rivalry and patriotism towards their new media counterparts."
On top of explicitly making the link to moral panics, Everett makes the observation that a lot of the fear-mongering is stoked by representatives of older forms of media. This emphasizes the importance of cross-generational tensions within the debate. Everett goes on to point out that moral panics with new forms of media are by no means a new concept.
From the clergy's concerns about the Gutenberg printing press, to the paternalist fears of romance novels, to electrical telegraph engineers, protective guilds, to religious censorship efforts against the movies, comic books, rock and roll music and television, to video games and the internet more contemporaneously, the history of Western civilization is abundant with moral panic episodes.
Everett exposes here the cyclical reaction society has to new forms of media. It is understandable people are cautious with new social phenomena, but with the fact that society continues to demonize them is a worrying trend. Everett goes on to theorize that the reason why video games and the internet are being so villainized in public consciousness is to distract from the potentially scarring issues with the previous generation of media.
Again, if public scrutiny is directed at one scandalized media, its vigilant gaze on another is temporarily averted. So, if we are worried about the stylized and aestheticized fictional violence in films and video games, the "if it bleeds it leads" charge levelled against television news shows and TV networks, other violent programming drop from the public radar screens, at least for a time. Displaced onto the threat of newer and deadlier media products, fear of the ubiquitous television violence gets a reprieve. More important, however, is that TV gets to define and disparage its competition while laundering its own violent and sensational images through the news and information departments.
This malicious side of moral panic, while sounding like a conversion to conspiracy territory, is understandable. Why wouldn't the older form of media take advantage of their social influence to disparage the next generation, if it results in being able to retain its level of relevance? And in the 22 years since Everett's article, her points have materialized. Interactive media has remained almost solely a form of entertainment with connotations of childishness and violent influence simultaneously staining the medium's social perception, especially in older generations. And when looking at the factors contributing towards this, older forms of media perpetuating these ideas is arguably the most impactful. Near the conclusion of Everett's article, she further theorizes that moral panic surrounding video games is used to distract from the bigger problems which can contribute to crime, but are not often favorable for mainstream culture to address.
It is absolutely the case that the depiction of graphic violence in video games is often alarming, gratuitous, and unsuitable for many segments of our youth and adult populations. But I wonder why there is not as sustained a focus on the myriad forms of other destructive influence that plague and damage our culture, like the culture of domestic violence, the culture of guns, the culture of racism, the culture of sexism, the culture of classism, the culture of ageism, the culture of anti-intellectualism, the anti-youth culture, the culture of anti-multiculturalism, and on and on.
This idea being discussed by Everett is a key principle of understanding moral panics in modern society. With all forms of media having such high level of control over what they portray, using moral panic as a form of diversion and scapegoating is a strategy often used within popular culture to ignore the issues they don't want to address, problems listed by Everett. The negative impact of this is a repeated villainization of counterculture, as well as perpetuating generational tension and reinforcing prejudices. Returning to Ferguson and Markey, they exemplify this in comparing media reactions to violence committed by white youth and black youth. Ferguson and Markey use a 1993 example of 19-year-old African-American Nathan Dunlap, who, in the same evening as playing a shooting game, shot and killed 4 of his former co-workers. However, very little of the media coverage focused on the potential that his video game activity could have influenced his behaviour. Ferguson and Markey explained this, saying,
"Violence among minority kids in urban areas didn't often garner much attention, and when it did, the violence was blamed on the kids and communities themselves. But horrific acts of violence by white kids, supposedly coming from nice families, violated the prejudice that youth violence was a minority/urban phenomenon."
Ferguson and Markey spend a large portion of their book discussing the weaponization of moral panics, and I believe this is one of the most explicit examples. In this extract, we see how media can strategically utilize or omit moral panic to reinforce hegemonic societal prejudices, in this case being youth violence is a minority urban problem, which is just a natural occurrence, but whenever white middle-class youth commit a violent crime, there has to be an external corrupting influence. This is just one example, but it represents how moral panic can be used by those with influence to reaffirm social biases. Of course, this is not just an issue in gaming. By creating the image of a public enemy, prejudice based on class, race, gender, sexuality, religion, etc. can be normalized on a societal level. So how do they link this back to censorship? Returning to Everett's article, they state,
"Since these newest mass media threaten many vested interests and strike terror into the hearts of many technophobes and neo-Luddites, the internet in general, and video games in particular, have come under special scrutiny, and thus are particularly vulnerable to shrill public calls for accountability, regulation, and ultimately, censorship."
As Everett shows here, moral panic is one of the most efficient tools when it comes to governing bodies justifying censorship. By making a large enough portion of the population paranoid that a certain medium can corrupt the moral foundation of a society, it does not make it hard to restrict access to said medium. Much of the discussion around censorship in gaming surrounds this fear of censorship spiraling, but it is important to distinguish when certain parts of the gaming population are just being paranoid themselves, or whether there is genuine cause for concern. As previously stated, a lot of the conversation surrounding censorship in gaming is disproportionately concerned with the potential for censorship and the possibility that it could spiral out of control, and for the most part this is accurate in the West. There have been very few moves to actually censor video games. However, this is not the case globally. As I've referenced in the first section, in recent history the Chinese government has been increasing its efforts to restrict access to games within its borders, while also restricting the content produced by its own rapidly growing gaming industry. This mirrors a lot of the fears Western gamers have had for decades, but why has it materialized in China? How much control is held, and what are the chances their policies could spread to other countries? Before I go into detail on this, I wanted to preface an important distinction. While this section focuses largely on the censorship efforts of the Chinese government, I want to avoid conflating criticism of the government with criticism of the country as a whole. When talking about decisions made by a country's leaders, it is easy for people to assume that the attitude of a government fully represents a country's citizens. And while they may represent a portion or even a majority, that does not erase the experience of the individuals in that country. A very typical example of this is when a government imposes homophobic laws or a surveyor's take on gay rights. Western critics often label the whole country as homophobic. This often features observers centering their potential experience if they were to hypothetically visit that country, while wholly overlooking the experience and oppression of those living in that country. So while I will be highlighting unsavory aspects of the Chinese government's censorship regime, please do not overlook the main victims of this being the Chinese citizens. Firstly, a paper by Jeffrey Knockel, Lotus Run, and Masashi Crete Nishihata on the logistics of Chinese censorship in mobile games puts the system in perspective. They describe,
with an estimated value of over $27.5 billion in 2017, China represents the largest gaming market in the world.
In spite of its massive gaming population, Knockel et al. Go into detail on the government-imposed restrictions placed on this market.
In 2010, China's Ministry of Culture, MOC, published a Regulation 15 listing a number of prohibited topics for online games, violating basic principles set by the Constitution, jeopardizing national unity, state sovereignty, and territorial integrity, leaking state secrets, endangering state security or damaging state honor and interests, instigating ethnic hatred or discrimination, jeopardizing ethnic unity, and infringing ethnic rituals or customs, promoting heretical or superstitious ideas, spreading rumours, disrupting social order and stability, lawful rights of others, transgressing social morality, and other contents forbidden by laws and administrative regulations. Transgressing social morality and other contents forbidden by laws and administrative regulations.
While some of these restrictions are entirely understandable and are likely unwritten rules in most other parts of the world, some of the latter points are in much more unnerving territory. For example, promoting heretical or superstitious ideas, disrupting social order and stability, disseminating obscenity, and transgressing social morality. These points especially can be interpreted in some very oppressive ways, as well as being largely subjective. Knockel et al. Emphasizes state-imposed subjectivity, saying,
the vague definitions of prohibited topics make it unclear how to stay within the line and have been called pocket crimes because anything can fit into them. This regulatory environment can push companies to over-censor.
This pipeline from vague restrictions to over-censoring is understandable, as companies obviously do not want to be putting their products into risky territory. However, by over-censoring, products can get closer and closer to falling into the definition of propaganda. Xiaoxun Zhang wrote a paper giving examples on how this can affect localization of games coming into China. One of Zhang's most detailed examples is on how the Chinese government controls games which oppose their political agenda.
Games that contain political references, especially those which include territorial issues relating to Taiwan and Tibet, both considered by the government as provinces that are part of PR China and not independent territories, seem to be specifically prone to clash with the Chinese authorities.
Of course, references to real countries are present with many games taking place in a real-world setting, so this can lead to problems. Zhang explains an example of this.
In 2004, according to a report by Sheng and Zhu, MOC banned Hearts of Iron, a Swedish-made computer game set against the background of World War II from 1936 to 1948. It was banned for distorting history and damaging China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. MOC considered that the game misrepresented some historical facts. Furthermore, the regions of Manchuria, West Xinjiang, and Tibet were marked as independent sovereign states in the maps of the game set during the 1940s, and Taiwan appeared as a territory belonging to Japan, which was considered to harm China's territorial integrity.
This example of historical distortion is disturbing, but what I find even more jarring is the self-censorship of the Chinese version of 2005's Civilization 4, which Yang goes on to describe.
The localizers rewrote nearly the whole storyline about China in an attempt to keep official censorship forces at bay. Thus, China was changed into the imaginary Zhu Kingdom, with its capital in the city of Bay City, and two leaders named Xingong and Tangong. The background briefing, which functions as an introduction, clearly states that the game is a fictitious story and does not link it to true historical facts. All references to the former communist leader Mao Zedong were erased, and the Great Wall and the Three Gorges Dam were replaced by the wonders of the Macedonian Line in Europe and the Hoover Dam in the USA. Interestingly, communism was renamed perfectionism, which may be seen as an overt propaganda strategy to placate censors.
In spite of the game making clear that its content is fictitious, the fact that every other country portrayed is shown to be relatively historically accurate in conjunction with the pandering or referring to a country's ideology as perfectionism definitely fits into the propaganda label which Zhang provides. Zhang also gives insight into the methods used by the Chinese government to justify their censorship efforts.
Protection of minors is often cited as a major reason for censorship in digital games localization. Unlike other forms of censorship, such as literature censorship, censorial operations on games conducted by governments has been mostly welcomed and supported by parents, educators, and retailers, notwithstanding criticism that it tramples on basic human rights such as freedom of speech.
This protection of minors in opposition to freedom of speech links back strongly to ideas often brought up surrounding moral panics. While much of the discussion earlier displayed how moral panic was used to justify negative attitudes towards certain media, this is an example of the next stage. Moral panic uses full justification for censorship. This also connects to the points of censorship listed by Knockel et al., listed earlier, most notably games that transgress social morality. However, it would be unfair to ignore the backlash this policy has received. Zhang emphasizes the frustration that Chinese gamers have with the ineptitude of the censors. He explains,
"The examination process is very simple." He explained that 3 experts were invited to examine all the components of a game using the account number and password provided by the game producers, which grant them full access to the highest level. However, given that most of the online games are of considerable length, it would take a substantial amount of time to inspect all parts of the game, and it is for this reason that, according to Jin, nobody could have enough time to inspect all the details, adding that the standards and procedures for reviewing games are out of date and suffer from many flaws. He also conceded that, not being a game player himself, he does not know everything that needs to be known about games.
Non-gamers being the most influential in controlling game access is understandably hypocritical, and the reaction that Zhang describes displays this.
His frank comments provoked large-scale criticism amongst the game-playing population in China. Many considered it inappropriate to have a game reviewed by 3 people who, by their own admission, have insufficient knowledge about games, but still are invested with the authority to decide on the influence that a game may have on the players of all ages, especially adolescents, and ultimately to decide on whether to approve its release in China or not.
While this is hardly as pressing an issue as the more politically charged aspects, it is worrying that the people who have the most control of the media consumed by the largest gaming population in the world are seemingly unqualified for the job. Moving on from the more political censorship described by Knockel et al. And Zhang, the issue which is much more topical at present is the censorship of social issues. And, as we have previously acknowledged, social aspects play a large influence in moral panic and the censorship surrounding it. Since 2018, Chinese censors have been showing signs of growing harsher and harsher in their restrictions, with approvals getting delayed more often. But this came to a head in early 2021, where Chinese President Xi Jinping made a statement personally denouncing video games as a harmful influence on the youth of China. Following this, stricter rules were announced throughout the coming months, notably restricting under 18s to only playing for limited times and limited windows. But a ruling which affects not just video games but all Chinese media was announced last September. Crossley reported,
China ordered broadcasters on Thursday to shun artists with incorrect political positions and effeminate styles, and said a patriotic atmosphere needed to be cultivated, widening a crackdown on its booming entertainment industry.
And in NPR's article on the subject, they directly link these attitudes to anti-rebellion causes.
China's government banned effeminate men on TV and told broadcasters Thursday to promote revolutionary culture, broadening a campaign to tighten control over business and society and enforce official morality.
While it seemed at first that this enforced morality would only affect broadcast media, later in the month it was shown that it would affect games as well, with Cohen and Yang reporting.
The companies also pledged to crack down on content that distort history or promote effeminate behaviour, and will also work to prevent breaches of these rules, such as the use of foreign gaming platforms, the CGIGC said.
While this was not the first time the Chinese government had made a statement against certain ideas and morals, or in this case a type of person, and had wanted to limit their representation, it was the strongest ruling they had made, since Chinese games had become so popular globally. Just around this time, it was reported that Chinese title Genshin Impact had the highest grossing first year of any video game, making an insane $3.7 billion in its first year. Notably, a lot of Genshin Impact's early advertising and marketing of their title spotlighted Venti, a character highly important and influential to the earliest parts of the game's narrative, and because of this became a quick fan favourite. However, as you can imagine based on context, Venti is represented in a very typically effeminate style, which while controversial in some circles, could arguably be considered as a factor to his popularity. Since the ban was announced, many fans voiced their concern that characters like Venti would be removed from the game, and while that has not materialized, Venti has also been wholly absent from any new content since the ban, in spite of the character being so synonymous with the game's first very successful year. However, it is possible this is just a coincidence, with rumours the character will be returning in a future update. But we will have to wait and see if a more toned-down masculine Venti greets us when this comes. So, while the ban on effeminate men has yet to make much of an impact on mainstream Chinese gaming, the impact of censorship has started to materialize in Genshin Impact with the censorship outfits I referenced in the introduction. This covering up of female characters, while not seeming like that big of an issue, can still be linked to moral panic. Openly sexual women have been condemned in almost every recorded era of history, and often have been seen as a corruptive influence. But as I stated in the introduction, this change has garnered very little controversy, with discussions over hypothetical changes sometimes gaining even more attention than these real examples of censorship. I want to talk about the reaction to these outfits more, but I will save it for later on. For now, I think I have given a good look on how moral panic-infused censorship can genuinely impact the media of video games, using China as the most prevalent example. But with this information, it is interesting to look back on those who claim video games have been getting censored in the West for decades now. So moving on, I think we need to get our misconceptions redefined. Sorry if it's taken me a while to get to this point, especially since it was a main goal with this video, but I wanted to make sure to have all the relevant context out there before I start telling people that they're wrong. Alas, a lot of people are wrong, and that is why I believe the debate around video game censorship is as muddled as it is. The main point I want to make in this section is one of categorization. When looking back at the history of what has been considered video game censorship, the main examples can actually be split into 3 categories: regulation, localization, and actual censorship. The best way to go about these categories is to get defining and show some examples you may be familiar with. Firstly, I want to get regulation out of the way. While it relates to localization, it does not really fall under its definition. Regulation in relation to video games is when a game is judged by a regulatory board like the ESRB in America or PEGI in Europe, and the distribution of the game is controlled based on how these organizations rate these games, often put under age brackets. Similar to a few of the points made in this piece, the history of these regulatory boards is well documented and has already been well analysed. What I will mention, however, is that ESRB itself was formed in direct response to moral panic surrounding violence in games in the 90s, and as a display of the impact public outrage can have. But what separates these regulatory bodies from censorship is the way they operate. These organisations are largely self-regulatory, and the guidelines they work off mostly focus on violence rather than anything political or moral. In addition, they rarely outright ban a game, and if it is ever the case, it is usually only in the most extreme cases. While the definition of what these boards define as extreme could be debated, that subject deserves much more time than I can give it here. Although this regulation is important to acknowledge, it doesn't fit all too much into the modern conversations surrounding video game censorship, as their limits are well known as well as largely uncontroversial. Now moving on to localization, the distinction I think is the most important. Localization is a phrase that has been brought up a fair few times throughout this piece, but in the discussions surrounding censorship it is often misrepresented. In video games, the definition of localization is to change a game so it can be released in another country to make it more appropriate for selling there. This process is often conflated with translation, and while translation falls under the umbrella of localization, it by no means encapsulates the whole process. Returning to Carmen Manieron's paper, which covers the history of Japanese games getting localized, in their explanation for localization they state,
in-game localization Translators focus on the user, known as the player or gamer, terms that highlight the ludic nature of games and facilitate the immersion and enjoyment of the game. Localization can encompass the modification of any element of the original product to adapt it to the target market.
So as manner on displays here, translating the language is only a portion of localization, but adapting the game into the target market is often far more complex. This adaptation is where most issues with localization stem from. An article will be released highlighting a change made to a game upon localization, and it will be immediately hit with a tirade of comments, forum posts, and reaction videos, labeling the act as censorship, which makes looking at these posts all the more frustrating, seeing localization being somehow almost always overlooked and replaced with an accusation of something it just isn't. Maniron goes on to explain the motivation behind changes made in localization.
When the culture-specific elements present in a Japanese game are confusing, obscure, offensive, or simply not as funny as intended for target players, it is advisable to neutralize, adapt, or omit them, taking into account their function in the game and aiming to achieve a similar function in the target version with an appropriate target culture reference.
This aspect of neutralizing obscure or offensive elements of a game to help them fit into the aforementioned target market is not a sign of malicious censorship, but purely a move made to make the game sell more. This is often done to make games fit into self-regulated age ratings which differ internationally. And of course, fitting a lower age rating makes the game accessible to a wider demographic. Whether you agree with this unfortunately capitalistic act, under the current structure of the industry, it's the best way to assure games become accessible to as wide an audience as possible, even if it upsets a vocal minority of that audience who deem a game ruined if it isn't a one-to-one adaptation. Matt S.'s previously mentioned article focuses entirely on this conflation of censorship and localization, and one of the key distinctions he makes is the difference in the accessibility of censored and discontinued products, using books as an example.
They will continue to exist in libraries, collections, and archives, and once those books pass into the public domain, anyone on the planet will be able to take it upon themselves to republish them. To reiterate, there is no censorship going on here.
He then goes on to link this to accusations of censorship made towards video games specifically.
Actual censorship occurs when a third party takes steps to limit the creator's vision to a community in its entirety. Sony deciding that it doesn't want anime boob games on the PlayStation is different from examples of actual censorship. When Sony does it, it's on the one platform. You can still access and play the game on PC, and quite possibly other consoles too.
This idea of accessibility is one of the defining features of localization. Localization is aimed to making games accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Matt S. exemplifies here that when games are insufficiently localized, Sony can choose to keep them off their digital stores. Even so, Western gamers can still import the Japanese version of these games or see if they get released on more independent platforms. But that is not an issue related to censorship, as there are no laws prohibiting these products from being enjoyed. Matt S. goes on to theorize on how localization can continue to be so controversial.
Similarly, I do think deep down, a lot of these people crying censorship in video games understand that it isn't really censorship. It's just that they want to play these anime boob games, and it becomes much more difficult to obligate Sony to publish them, and obligate the localizers to localize these games correctly if they can't rely on the censorship argument to make it look like these companies are doing something evil.
As I stated at the start of all this, censorship is widely considered to be wrong, and in its truest sense, it is. But as Matt S. points out here, if those who do not want games to be localized in a way that they do not approve of, they can always muddy the definition of censorship to give themselves a moral high ground, albeit a rocky one. While I do not believe everyone accusing these localizers as censors do this maliciously, I do believe there is a large presence of blissful ignorance when it comes to overlooking the truth of the situation. A final point from Matt S. is near the conclusion of this piece, where he goes on to give examples of what is and is not censorship. One of the most notable examples is when he points out,
another example of actual censorship is when the Chinese government forces a Taiwanese developer's game off the internet for poking fun at the Winnie the Pooh president. It is not when Valve decides that a game isn't right for Steam, and the difference is that, in the latter scenario, developers can still release their game on the various adult-only platforms instead.
This point solidifies the distinction between censorship, localization, and to a lesser degree self-regulation, by exemplifying Valve choosing not to distribute a game. However, what I want to focus on from this extract is the Winnie the Pooh censorship and use it to move on to our third and final definition, being true censorship. Just quickly before I get into this, I want to point out a common criticism of the distinction between localization and censorship being the potentially grey middle ground and how the issue is largely just semantics. It is hard to fully refute this criticism due to its breadth and how some people would simply prefer to stick to their own definitions. However, as you will see in the next section, I believe the most significant difference between the two is context. Now, the final definition. Censorship is defined by a suppression of public access to certain media, communication, or ideas which are seen as a threat politically or morally to the governing body enacting the censorship. While elements of this can be identified in moral panic surrounding video games, it can easily be fully realized in what we saw of how China censors their games industry. In spite of me having given a good range of examples on this censorship, I just want to give one more example of it in an effort to fully display what true censorship in video games is. I concluded the last definition with Matt S.'s point on 2019 game Devotion, which after a week of release was pretty much deleted off the face of the planet, for featuring a background piece of artwork comparing Chinese President Xi Jinping to Disney character Winnie the Pooh. This ban on the Winnie the Pooh related imagery features in all forms of media entering China, and a much more mainstream and absurd example of this being in the Chinese version of Kingdom Hearts 3. Joseph James Andrews Jr. reports on the change made to the game, stating,
"Instead of just removing the character from the game, which likely would have delayed Kingdom Hearts 3 more than it already was, it looked as if he was just painted over like a stain on the wall."
Referring to the insanely simplistic white light covering the bear's presence in the game, Andrews Jr. goes on to give a political context to the ban, saying,
"The comparisons began as a meme all the way back in 2013 when the Chinese president was pictured in a meeting with the then US President Barack Obama. While some people saw these comparisons as a point of mild amusement, many people in China that object to the rule of President Xi Jinping took the meme and expanded it immensely. It became one of many forms of protest for some citizens, but it didn't go ignored for long. The Chinese government took exception to these memes and outright banned any depictions of Winnie the Pooh in Chinese media."
While this ban may seem banal on the face of it, what it represents is a political figure being able to enact nationwide censorship based on a personal insecurity, but more importantly on the basis of speaking out against the government. This video is already pretty political just by its nature, but I do not think I have to say much to point out how insane this level of power is. Political figures do not have a divine right to rule, and as citizens, questioning their decisions is something to be done to make sure they are doing what is right for the people whose lives they control. And it is almost laughable that Winnie the Pooh represents this. It almost makes you wonder why non-Chinese companies like Square Enix with Kingdom Hearts are willing to make these changes, but Andrews Jr. concludes his report with the undeniable truth of the situation.
"Winnie the Pooh's censorship was likely a small sacrifice to make so that the game could reach a wider audience. The immensity of the Chinese market cannot be overstated, and when there's money to be made, some companies are willing to make the necessary adjustments."
In late 2021, it was reported worldwide that 2.96 billion people play video games, and around the same time it was revealed that over 720 million of those people are Chinese. I have referenced the size of China's gaming population throughout this piece, but I think this puts it into perspective. With China holding roughly a quarter of the gaming population, it is understandable that game developers are willing to submit to censorship in order to not miss out on such a massive portion of the market. This level of influence the Chinese government has with their censorship is why the reaction to the Genshin Impact skins shocked and frustrated me. While there were some complaints made by fans of the free-to-play game, the majority of reactions were either indifferent or even appreciative, and while I can understand on a base level those who prefer the new skins to the old ones, I still don't think it is appropriate to celebrate an action made as a consequence of censorship. As I have already previously alluded to, with the oversaturation of claims of censorship, there has become a disconnect when it comes to recognizing actual censorship. When the gaming population are aware of the constant claims of censorship, it is almost inevitable that a large section of gamers will become indifferent or even dismissive towards censorship in gaming, wanting to actively disassociate themselves from the often misguided group of anti-censorship gamers. This unfortunate byproduct has materialized in the conversation surrounding the Genshin Impact skins. A quick disclaimer, while I strongly disagree with the opinion portrayed in the following article and the way it was portrayed, my response to it is not a personal critique of the author, just the contents of the article. This is going to be seen by a small audience, but please don't go and personally berate the author. In an article posted by Jade King 8 days after the announcement of the Genshin Impact skins titled "Genshin Impact's new outfits are fabulous, censorship be damned," we can identify the circumstances I previously mentioned.
They can't be switched off right now, so many fans has been quick to cry out censorship as MiHoYo bows to the communist powers that be. The thing is, the studio is merely operating within the strict parameters it sadly has no control over.
This default to complain about picky gamers crying censorship is a direct consequence of the muddy definition of censorship, caused by the vocal sect of gamers nitpicking localization efforts. Unfortunately, the article progresses to make a few potentially problematic statements on the censorship King is presenting as a non-issue.
Despite the political reality underpinning Genshin Impact's existence, I have to admit that the new outfits are awfully fabulous. I hope the submission system becomes more relaxed in the months to come, but for now, at least we have some cute outfits to entertain ourselves with. It is censorship, regardless of how relaxed it might seem, and there's a conversation worth having about how far this might stretch before the creators are forced to give up on their creative integrity in order to appease requirements that are far from reasonable.
While there is no issue with preferring the new skins, this personal opinion being used as dismissal to those, maybe for the first time, accurately identifying censorship feels wrong. And moving to her conclusion, having the response at least we have some cute outfits to entertain ourselves with, feels almost ominous in reaction to the consequences of a suppressive dictatorial government-imposed act. Personally, I prefer 2 of the 4 outfits added, but I wouldn't use that opinion as an excuse to say something which could be interpreted in support of genuine censorship. King goes on to wonder how far this relaxed censorship will go before it forces creators to give up their integrity to appease unreasonable requirements. It is irritating when people refuse to critique censorship if it A. doesn't affect them or B. benefits them. Questioning when this will become proper censorship worthy of serious reaction feels inappropriate, because no matter what the subject matter is, real censorship is worth critiquing and worth having a conversation about. These issues with the article are frustrating because there are some good points to be made about the lack of diversity and female representation in games, but unfortunately this is glossed over. I was going to write a little on this lack of diversity and representation, but my editor worded everything I could have said much more fittingly than I could, so here is what they had to say. The difference between male and female character design in Genshin is worth a brief mention. There is a diversity of outfit styles and male characters often fitting with their personalities, from the serious and entirely covered up Diluc to the excitable and scantily clad Itto. However, every single female character, regardless of personality, has a skin tight and or revealing element to her design. Take Beidou. She is loud and confident, and it feels like her outfit matches her energy. This is not so much the case with characters such as Jean, whose outfit features both skin tight and revealing elements despite her very reserved and serious personality. This is not to say that personality necessarily dictates personal style or modesty levels. It doesn't at all. It's just that the male characters' designs almost always reflect their temperaments. This isn't just an issue in Genshin Impact. It's noticeable in many video games, leaving plenty of real-life women with more modest personal styles feeling underrepresented. Government censorship shouldn't be the only way we are able to get less revealing female character designs. Perhaps if Genshin Impact and gaming as a whole included female characters with a more diverse range of clothing styles, as they already do with male characters, people would have less reason to feel conflicted or even celebratory around instances of censorship. While this issue is not the main focus of this essay, its importance cannot be understated or trivialized. Underrepresented demographics should not be forced to choose between celebrating representation and critiquing censorship, but unfortunately this is a reality. Without freedom of expression, we lose freedom of judgment. If we cannot see certain creators expressing their sexist biases, we cannot judge and critique them, or make an effort to improve the state of representation as a reactionary counter. If these images are just censored, we lose the critical ability as a society to be able to discuss and debate these issues. It seems insane to be having this discussion over boob coverage, but if that boob coverage, for once, actually represents repression, then it is worth having the conversation. With the Genshin Impact censorship skins still being a news story which, as I have mentioned, garnered little reaction in the grand scheme, I think I have milked the topic dry, but I hope I have been able to accurately convey my frustration surrounding this example of censorship. And with that done, I am relatively confident I have been able to accurately portray the distinctions between regulation, localization, and censorship. So what is left to say? At the start of this, I set out to give context to the discussion surrounding video game censorship as well as an insight into the debate which it encompasses. To briefly summarize, the conversation has been going since the medium became popular in the 70s and up until the 2000s. The debate largely orbited the prospect of violence in video games potentially influencing younger players. The debate cooled down in the mainstream leading into the 2010s and morphed into a more niche complaints around the localization of JRPGs being labelled as censorship. While this element of the conversation is still present, the focus is now more on the totalitarian examples of undeniable censorship like what is present in China, and given extra attention given the rapidly growing size of China's gaming industry. I then went on to introduce the concept of moral panic and how this was tied into all eras of game censorship, especially the early debates on violence and its impact. This led to the next section focusing more in depth on China and how this censorship has been influenced by moral panic, as well as emphasizing the scale at which China censors and the government's motivation to do so. I then finished by clarifying the differences between regulation, localization, and real censorship. As I stated during the last section, the distinction between localization and censorship is the most important aspect of this essay, and while the rest of the essay is relevant, it best serves the piece as context for the importance of this distinction. While I believe I have already beaten the dead horse of this distinction sufficiently, but the relevance it holds in having an informed perspective on the debate of censorship in gaming cannot be understated. The most obvious application of this skill is its help in identifying true censorship and therefore where to point our complaints. For example, when a game undergoes significant changes upon localization, complaints are much more likely to have an impact if they are accurately identifying the business decisions of publishers, rather than a misguided accusation of censorship. And the more unspoken adverse is true, yes, I'm going to mention them again, I promise this is the last time, with the Genshin Impact skins, with people acknowledging the presence of censorship but treating it like localization due to the lack of serious impact it has on non-domestic players, and those few getting outraged are overlooked due to the connotations they likely hold with the aforementioned misguided censorship accusations. I don't want to slip into the territory of preaching and self-aggrandizing, but I hope I have been able to unravel some of the complexity and how the censorship in gaming conversation has been ever developing since the creation of the medium into what it has become today, and I hope with this context the importance of recognition and accurate critique of censorship can be promoted to maybe make some impact on this convoluted issue. And we've made it to the outro. Thank you so much if you've made it this far. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a slog, but I got some thank yous to get out of the way. First of all, Shaq and Annie always do an amazing job editing. They make it so much easier to understand what I'm saying. And also thanks again to Jay for doing the voiceover for all the quotes. He always does an amazing job. I think it kind of breaks up the monotony of my voice. And finally, of course, the very talented Botanautical for doing my thumbnail again. It's actually based off some official art of Venti and Barbara. I think it was released before Genshin came out, but I just thought it'd be nice to switch it up and have Winnie in there, obviously because of his relevance in this, but they've done an amazing job. It looks amazing, and their Tumblr and Instagram are in the comments, not the comments, description, so go and support them. They're amazing, and yeah, they got loads of other art, so check them out. On to some more stuff related to the essay. I kind of wanted to apologize for having maybe a slightly too niche perspective, not super niche, but I could have, obviously it's a very global issue and I could have talked about some other countries, but I just wanted to focus on stuff which has enough sources for me to not come off as uninformed. Like there's other places which have very interesting perspectives on censorship, like obviously countries like Russia have their issues, and also like places like Australia have very interesting rules with it, where like apparently their regulation can kind of slip into territory which could be censorship, but I think I mentioned it during the essay, but that's kind of deserves its own video, and I wish I found that earlier on, but yeah. Also, there's loads of examples of localization efforts being labeled as censorship, which I really wanted to talk about because it's kind of, as I mentioned, it's something people see all the time, these people calling stuff which is localization censorship, and it's always kind of funny. Like, I think I kind of wish I got to expose kind of more of the humor of it, but one of my favorite examples I really wish I got time to talk about or like fit in is a couple years ago when Persona 5 Royal got released and they took out some kind of undeniably homophobic dialogue in the game, like a very minor conversation, but loads of people were calling it censorship and ruining the plot, and it was kind of hilarious. But it's also interesting because I didn't know this until I researched it a little bit, but it was changed because of an interest group kind of protesting the game. So there's also, I don't know, maybe I could do like another short follow-up on that, but to be fair, so many people have talked about it already, but I just think it's so funny. Also, something which I didn't notice until literally the final editing of this, in the section where I talk about Xenoblade Chronicles X, there's a quote which I used and Jay did the voiceover for, where it's like directly copied from the article because it's a quote, and it says, oh, the players are given potions to customize their characters, and I didn't realize, and none of my editing friends noticed it, no one noticed it until literally the last stage, that potions was probably meant to be options, and I'm assuming the article was just published, not changing it to options, and I was just like, oh, I've played that game, they don't give you potions to customize your characters, that's so dumb. But yeah, I just thought it was funny, and if you picked up on that, because Jay reads it out as potions, and I was just like, it's not potions, what am I thinking? Anyway, sorry for the rambling, but yeah, that's all I wanted to say, just some kind of Opposite of disclaimer, postclaimer, whatever it's called. But no, thank you again for getting this far. And I've got one other video about Bayonetta, which is kind of a more specific case study on something. It's not completely related to this. I'm not always going to mouth off about like censorship and stuff like that, but it's the kind of thing I'm interested in. But yeah, there's another video about this length on Bayonetta. So if you like this video style, go and check that out. And if you've already watched that, go and subscribe, because I'm hoping to keep posting videos like this, maybe a bit shorter. I wanted this one to be shorter than the last one, but then it just ended up being this long. So hopefully I can make something which isn't novella length eventually, but we'll see. Anyway, thanks for watching.